We're going to talk about mail-in voting. So our president tweeted this comment a couple of months ago, and he said, "There is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent." So this statement is completely false, and we will talk about the subject, which is mail-in voting. So as a volunteer in a local campaign organizing group, I have researched and talked to a lot of voters and a lot of campaign organizers, and I feel like I am now researched and fluent enough in mail-in voting laws that I can actually tell you about mail-in voting. So the reason that this is relevant to all of us is because it is our constitutional right to vote, and a pandemic cannot take that right from us or afford that right for us not to vote. So our forefathers did not fight in the war for us just to give that right away during a pandemic. So an easy fix for that is for the option of mail-in voting to be expanded in Texas. So mail-in voting can become a lifeline of democracy if we allow it to be a lifeline of democracy in Texas, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, is how mail-in voting can become a lifeline or an option to all of us to vote during a pandemic. So my opponent is going to talk to you about three opposing items on why they think mail-in voting should not be expanded, and I'm going to talk to you about why mail-in voting should be expanded. So the opposing perspective from my opponent is mail-in voting equals fraud. So the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton argues that mail-in voting equals more fraud in elections. So that's what they are saying. They're also saying that not a lot of people favor mail-in voting, so we should definitely not pay attention to that. So that's what my opponent is saying when mail-in voting is fraudulent. The second perspective that my opponent is talking about is person voting is safe. So a lot of state representatives now are saying that in-person voting is safe during a pandemic. That's what my opponent is saying. And they're also saying that fear to contract COVID-19 is not a good enough reason for us to want to get mail-in voting ballots. So that's what my opponent is saying. And the third perspective that my opponent is saying is mail-in voting favors the opposing party. So what they are saying is that mail-in voting usually favors the Democrats rather than the Republicans. So my perspective on mail-in voting in the first stance is voting by mail is not fraudulent. It does not have more fraud than in person. So an NPR discussion or research said that 0.00006% of mail-in voting rate that's the voting rate of fraud in mail-in voting stations. So also a Pew Research Center statement mentions that 70% of Americans would actually want the option to have that mail-in voting option when they want to vote. So the second perspective is voting is safe. In-person voting is safe during a pandemic. So according to a Lawfare study, the average individual comes in contact with 20 people while voting, and the poll worker comes in contact with over 700 individuals. So each contact increases the ability or the risk of that individual catching a disease or a virus like COVID-19. Also, 60% of Americans would want to have the option to have mail-in voting, especially during a pandemic. 60% of Americans want this option during a pandemic to vote by mail. And my third perspective is that mail-in voting favors the opposing team. So a PNAS research study, which is the proceedings for the National Academy of Science, have concluded that mail-in voting does not favor another party. So this is completely false what my opponent is saying. So they are saying that mail-in voting favors Democrats. This research study says that it's not the case at all. So what I'm going to tell you is basically that we should allow mail-in voting to be the lifeline of our democracy today, because mail-in voting can help us tell our voices to as voters, to have our voices heard during a pandemic. So what I'm basically trying to say is that I'm urging you to call your congressman and tell him that you would want mail-in voting to be expanded in Texas, because there's no way that a pandemic or COVID-19 can erase those rights that we have enshrined in the Constitution and be stolen by those who are, in a sense, in the medieval hierarchical system. Thank you so much.